afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Hello. My name is Mary Angela. I think I've either just recently met or know most of you. So thank you so much for coming. I'm the director of the Center on the Hill. And it is my pleasure to kick off the Forum on the Hill for the 2022-23 season. So thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. It is my great pleasure to introduce John Wilkinson, who began his service as pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Chestnut Hill in September of 2019, after serving 18 years as the pastor of the Third Presbyterian Church in Rochester, New York. He received his BA from the College of Wooster, his Master's of Divination from, is that right? Okay, sorry. I should have asked before. From McCormick Theological Seminary, and his PhD from Northwestern University, focusing on 20th century American religious history. We had previously hoped to hear John speak last April, but due to unforeseen circumstances, he was not able to, so we're very pleased to have him back kicking off our season this year. Please welcome John Wilkinson.
Well, just to be clear, the unforeseen circumstances were COVID, so it hit me in Holy Week, and I mean, that's all right. Everybody knows, at least the church people knew I had COVID because they had to say, where on earth is he during Holy Week? So it's great to see everyone, and hello to everybody, the thousands of people who will be watching this after the fact in the download. And what I want to do for a time is talk some, but feel free to interrupt me. We're informal and casual, and we're all friends here, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for some more conversation. And I first wanted to say a little bit of disclaimer about the title. We're not still a post-pandemic church. I still think in many ways the pandemic is going on, but you get what I mean when I say that. We're in a new phase of it, I think, and we're going to try to figure out what post-pandemic might look like, not just in the church, but in lots of different avenues. But I wanted to say that just off the bat, and I got to figure out how to use this thing. So anyway, here we are, and I left the original date. I was ready to go for this on April 14th, because it was also Holy Week, you may remember, and so I left the original date up there. I've done a couple versions of this in the church on a Sunday morning, and then I keep revising it, because new stuff keeps coming to our mind. There we go. So what I really want to say is, I'm not sure any of us have firm conclusions about all this. And I think anybody who says this is how it's going to be moving forward, I would question that. I think so much still feels fluid and uncertain and changing, and we should just embrace that. And what I tell our guys here, and I'm not presuming we're all church people in the room, but some of us are, what I tell our guys, whether our leaders or our staff people, is take a deep breath and not get too worried about where we are at the moment. And I'll talk about that in a minute. We were already in the midst of lots of changes and shifts. COVID kind of accelerated it, highlighted some things, presented some opportunities. So I really am sharing some impressions and my opinions and some other opinions, but there are lots of questions that we still want to, keep asking. So there you go. Wait. The other thing is, I keep forgetting, I did this fancy PowerPoint setup and I forget. Some of you know who Ted Lasso is, or what the show is. It's a phenomenal show, you should all watch it. But there's a great scene in one of the Ted Lasso episodes where his kind of premise is, be curious, not judgmental. And I think that's where I feel like I am right now in terms of the church and pandemic and how we're going to navigate. In another conversation, Mary Angela, maybe this can be the next time, but I did 3 church visits this summer. Every one of them addressed COVID in different ways. And all those ways were appropriate to their context and their setting and their leadership. And it would be easy to say, well, why did you do it that way and not this way? But I didn't go to visit those churches to do that anyway. But they could say the same thing about us here or the church down the street. So the curiosity about this really is important, and not judging, I think, is equally important. Now clearly there are some decisions you can make that are stronger or not as strong, but we did our best during that time, and I think other churches did too. So I just want to put that out there. And I'm going to read from a couple books, so I have to take my glasses off to read. My eyesight has actually got better at the last exam, which was really weird. But anyway, so there's a book by an Episcopal priest named Stephanie Spellers called The Church Cracked Open. And then the subtitle is Disruption, Decline, and New Hope for Beloved Community. And her premise in her book is, and I'm really focusing on those first two words, disruption and decline, although I usually say it in reverse order, and we'll get to the decline part in a minute. But the church was in the middle of, and when I say the church in America, we can slice and dice that a bunch of different ways, and we will in a minute, but also there are trends that are pretty common across the board. Evangelical, conservative, progressive, mainline, Catholic, whatever. Not always in all the cases, but in general, there's some consistency there. So decline, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then she'll talk about two disruptions that the church has experienced in the last couple of years. Anybody, let's shout them out. Two disruptions. Anybody? COVID. What's the second disruption? George Floyd. And all of the attendant experiences, reactions, responses to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and those twin disruptions, as she calls them, and it's not like that, the George Floyd reality about racism in the U.S. started that day, but it really brought things to a focal point that hadn't really been the case before that. So disruption and decline, and this it's a book that there's a little, I'm just going to read a paragraph or two from it. So let me do that. She uses a notion of unraveling, that things are unraveling right now for the American church, which I think is really interesting, that there was what she calls a tapestry of dominant American Christianity, and whether we think we were in that or not, we were. Dominant American Christianity that was generally white and generally Protestant. That tapestry was already full of loose threads, has snagged, pulled, and is unraveling. And she says we simply can't tuck some threads back in, but we need to do a whole new re-raveling project. So just kind of keep that in mind. And it's kind of provocative. So that's that. Here's some numbers. Some of you are numbers people. I had a physics teacher that said figures lie and liars figure, but at least this is a starting point for where the mainline Protestant denominations might be, and then I dropped a couple others in there. So UMC, United Methodist Church, kind of the big Protestant mainline denomination. Look where they've gone from 1975 to 2020. That's not an insignificant drop. We're Presbyterian Church USA. We're less than half of what we were in 1975, and that was 2 years ago. We're already at 1.1 in 2021, which is the last time we did our numbers. So it's clear to see at some point soon we'll be under 1 million members in our denomination. Roman Catholicism has enjoyed the opposite trend, and anybody want to venture a guess why that is? What the bulk of that is? Immigrant populations, yes, coming from other countries, bringing their Catholicism with them. And when I put this together back in the spring, 2020 numbers weren't available, but I know that those numbers are kind of plateauing. You can kind of see them plateauing from 2000 to 2015. And I think those will continue to plateau, and at some point that's not a sustainable growth curve. We just kind of know that. Assemblies of God, a white conservative denomination, was experiencing growth, but look at that plateauing as well. I mean, it doubled from 75 to 2000 and now is plateauing. And the SBC, the Southern Baptists, who we all have some presumption about, they're now beginning a decline. So just know most of this, and you probably read this week, I didn't have a chance to get that slide in here, that by some certain numbers, so don't quote me on this and don't quote me online, but at a certain point, like 20 or 30 years from now, religious participation in the US, in terms of people who identify as Christian, will be under 50%, which is a significant statistical marker. So here's a couple other things from Gallup polls and things. I'll read these. I don't know how I'll read them. So this was from March of 2021, so just a little bit over a year ago. Americans' membership in houses of worship continued to decline last year, dropping below 50% for the first time in Gallup's 8-decade trend. In 2020, 47% of Americans said they belonged to a church, synagogue, or mosque, down from 50% in 2018 and 70% in 1999. The decline in church membership is primarily a function of the increasing number of Americans who express no religious preference. So we often think, we in the mainline Protestant universe often think people are leaving here and going to another church. But the surveys say, no, what people are doing is not going anywhere, or they're going to the church of the New York Times on a Sunday morning, or church of whatever on a Sunday morning or Saturday morning or whatever. So over the past 2 decades, the percentage of Americans who do not identify with any religion has grown from 8% in '98 to 13% in 2008 and 21% over the past 3 years. Again, what you do with those numbers is what we do with those numbers. And then you say, well, what about the Roman Catholic world? I've got a quotation for that. More Gallup poll from March. The percentage of Catholics who say they are a member of a church has dropped by nearly 20 points since the year 2000, according to a new report Gallup released, whatever that Monday was. I should fix that slide. Among the respondents who said they were Catholic, only 58% actually said they were a member of a church. This figure is down 18 points from the 76% of Catholics who said they were a member of the church in a previous survey from 1998. So you get the difference. If you say that there's about how you identify, but then how you practice what you identify, and that gap is growing. I can't quantify that for us, but I think that's true for us as well. So there's a great book, James Hudnut Boimler, who's a friend of mine. He was the Boimler in the marriage, and he married Heidi Hudnut, and they made the decision to hyphenate. I'm just kidding. I know these guys. Anyway, they're both church historians. Jim teaches at Vanderbilt Divinity School. They wrote a great book in 2018 called The Future of Mainline Protestantism. And they talk about this major reconfiguration that their kind of historical work and sociological work bears out. And in that reconfiguration is something we just said, immigration and the impact on American Catholicism, the realignment of non-Catholic Christians, the rise of the nuns, not nuns like Sisters of Mercy, but nuns as in persons who are not identifying as nun when you're given a religious survey. And then here's kind of the quote: the bottom line for the future of a religion in America is that all religious groups are under pressure to adapt to a society where religious identity is increasingly seen as a matter of choice. I think we all know that, but it's interesting to see it kind of quantified and qualified. Chris?
What is realignment of the non-Catholics? What does that mean?
I mean, we're all going to different places or not going to any place at all. So I think it's, yes, that. So yeah, a kind of reshuffling of things. So anyway, so that's, adapt. So the pressure to adapt, that's one thing. I'll get you in a minute, Jeff, to a society where religious identity is increasingly seen as a matter of choice. So we all know the kind of old school thing where you moved to a new community, got a new job, whatever, and you found a church to belong to. And that was an important kind of cultural thing as well as a religious thing. That's just kind of not the case anymore and happens in a lot of different ways. Jeff, what are you going to say?
You just answered my question. I was wondering what it meant by
is just not, I mean, you tell me. I mean, you tell me about your own, I mean, I'm not saying you tell me right now, but you tell me in general, what are your practices, or what are your children or grandchildren's practices now, where they're not automatically landing at any church. And again, for today, that's not, oh,
Sorry, people respect it, but it can be seen as quaint in the
right.
world.
So what Ann said is people still respect religious practice, but it can also be seen as quaint beyond the circles of that. And again, today it's just curiosity, not judgmentalism, and I'm really about that. But I mean, but it is what's going on. So I want to zip through this a little bit. So here's a quote from a Washington Post article: "Church attendance and membership have long been on the decline in America. My guess," and this was I forget who the columnist is, "my guess is that because many folks realize that fear is at the root of so much religious conviction," so this was an editorial, not a news article, "the proposition has become untenable. Those fears have led too many people of faith to police the way that others choose to live their lives. The trend away from church will likely continue. Most of us have enough fear and bullying in our lives already." Now, in the spring, we discussed this on a Sunday morning at our place. Is that really what everybody's religious experience it is? But I think we know in the world out there, that perception of what happens in a place like this is there. I'll just zip through this. Okay, so this was a Pew poll about a year ago. We thought that as the pandemic progressed and things got a little bit better and a vaccine happened and all that, that church attendance would start to increase, and the numbers say no, that church attendance is remaining flat. What'll be really interesting is that going to be true kind of from in fall 22 and onward. We just don't know that yet. I'll skip that for right now. I'll skip the Great Resignation now too, because I wanted to talk about some other stuff. Except the Great Resignation is, it's happening in the ministry. It's also happening for teachers and lawyers and everything else, that people are quitting, resigning. Now, you've read in the last month or so lots of articles or essays about quiet quitting, which is people not quitting their jobs, but actually kind of ratcheting back how many hours or the commitment to them. But the Great Resignation is literally people leaving professions without knowing where they're going to next. And that's a COVID thing. And I think the implications of it are not yet quite figured out. And just anecdotally, I probably have 25 minister friends who've done this, who have said, I need to leave. And whether they're leaving the ministry forever or leaving the church where they've been serving, they're not going to a new place just yet, which is kind of an unheard of thing until this. If you left, you went somewhere else. But that's the Great Resignation. But lawyers tell me it's happening in lawyering, and teachers tell me it's happening in teachering and everything else. So I think just in terms of us paying attention to what's going on in the culture, we should pay attention to that. Here's another book. The Episcopalians seem to be writing a lot of books on the pandemic more than we are, but this is a really fine book. We Shall Be Changed, Questions for the Post-Pandemic Church. And let me just read one little paragraph from it, because I think this is true. Maybe two paragraphs. This moment of pandemic has therefore, and this is the author or the editor, Mark Eddington, who's an Anglican priest in Britain. This moment of pandemic has therefore made our moment one of unparalleled urgency for the Christian message. And then, will we or will we not proclaim that message not just in words but in action, not just in declaration but in decision? Then he writes, we do not yet have answers to the question of how the church shall be changed by this pandemic year. We'll say pandemic years. We're not yet able to say with certainty what the implications will be of a moment in which the people to whom the angels declare do not be afraid have been conditioned to be fearful of each other. We cannot say what a long practice of attending from home will mean to churches that try to gather their flocks. There is much we cannot yet discern. I think that's right. And the whole question of, and we don't know for sure around here, the question of online worship, streaming, what's that doing to attendance? I was just at a meeting in Washington with some of my peer group I'm part of, and of 10 ministers, 10 different experiences. For some, a church in San Diego, their in-person numbers are pretty flat, but their online numbers are kind of off the charts. In other places, the in-person are pretty flat, and the online numbers are pretty flat. And nobody really knows why that is. I don't think it's necessarily a matter of quality of production or anything like that. But again, I think that's a trend. When we, Bob Fless knows this, when we invested a pretty decent chunk of money here in good live streaming equipment, and now live stream every Sunday morning. And we know people across the country watch, not a billion, but some, and then some of our members who either aren't able to get out ever or are choosing not to get out quite yet because of COVID concerns are watching. But somebody said, well, now that we're kind of in this new phase where we can come back and you don't have to be asked if you don't want to, are we going to stop live streaming? And it was a question that kind of caught me off guard, because in my own mind I said, there's no way we can stop. But their point is live streaming encouraging people not to show up in person? And I don't know. I'm kidding, I'm still showing up in person. But I think the question is, as behaviors and patterns and habits keep evolving, I like the notion of, one of our members is on vacation, they'll log in on a Sunday morning, or they're sick, or they can't quite make it here. And is there a trade-off? I mean, I keep trying to have our conversation be people watching online are not kind of second-class citizens in the Sunday morning experience, but other churches I think are doing a better job than we are here. I can only say here in terms of making sure that's more the case, that there's a bridge between those who are online and those who are in person. And I'm glad that we can talk about that at the end. I want to keep kind of... So Rowan Williams, one more Episcopalian. You might have read him this week. He was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, a Welsh theologian who knew the Queen well. He wrote a really nice piece I read this week. And he's one of my, those who know he's one of my favorite guys. So he asked a couple of questions. Will the end of the lockdown see us finding the strength to face and name some of the things that have stood in the way of fairness, truth, and security? That would mean noticing who has been paying the heaviest price, and he's writing this from Britain, the ethnic communities and social groups that have been disproportionately affected, the people with mental health challenges who have had to live through nightmares and isolation, underprotected and poorly rewarded workers who have had little choice but to go on exposing themselves to risk so that the rest of us can have some basic amenities, young people whose employment prospects have disappeared overnight. If these have paid most heavily, we have to ask what needs going to guarantee a better deal for them. So kind of the ethical point of all this, and I want to keep, not just but I think we should keep those questions in front of us, as in many ways it feels like we think this thing's in the rearview mirror and we can press ahead, but the long-term impact of that. So that's that. The other thing I want to lift up, I've just read a really good article that continues to resonate with me. Susan Beaumont is a church consultant. Again, I think she's Episcopalian. I don't know, they should get some royalty in all this. But she's written, some of you heard me talk about this the other day, that we're in this weird season, kind of in between. She uses the phrase liminality a lot. So we're in a liminal season. We have been in a period of, and this is all that old Hegelian stuff, right? Orientation, disorientation, reorientation, that can look like a million different things, but separation, that was pandemic, a period in which order is stripped away from organizational structures, practices, and identity. The old way stops working. Now, a liminal period, a disorienting period of non-structure that opens new possibilities. New identities are explored and new possibilities are considered. And then reorientation, reforming period in which new structures and practices emerge that are better suited to an emerging identity. And her big point in this little article, and I'm glad to post it or give it to Mary Angela or whatever, is we think we're in reorientation But she's saying we're still in the middle one. We're still in this disorienting period. And we're still exploring new identities and new possibilities. But we're not there. So I'll skip some of this because I think I just summarized what she said. But it's tempting to believe that we completed the entire cycle during the pandemic. But remember, that season began well before the pandemic. And then she talks about these other things, climate, look at that, climate crisis, racial justice reckoning, political polarization, a host of other factors causing institutions to deconstruct and reorient. We are living through a cultural transformation, the outcome of which is still unknowable. And then she says that doesn't mean we can't be energized and hopeful. I certainly think we feel energized and hopeful around here. And I hope if you go to another church or a synagogue or a mosque, you feel some of that energy and hopefulness. But it's what she says, I like this sentence, at the same time, we cannot naively return to the old ways of being church. Amen to that, times a billion. This is a season that calls for ongoing disturbance, continued innovation, and the discovery of a new coherence. And then she says, what does that look like? So we need to modulate the level of disturbance. I think what that means is to say, let's take a deep breath. Let's be gentle with one another, whether it's a person working in a church or a person coming to a church. Let's remember we're all in the middle, and I didn't do anything with this today, but this incredible trauma that we've experienced as a nation and a world with death and illness and economic crisis and all these other things. We're all, whether we know it or not, or whether however we're dealing with it or not, are experiencing trauma and grief. So the gentleness that we need to be with one another, but modulate that. So people who are freaking out, church-wise anyway, we need to just keep saying, be chill. We can say it more articulately than that, but it's kind of be chill. Experiment and learn. At least here, this fall, we're going to do a lot of that. We're going to try some new things. And what I keep saying is let's try it, we'll do our best. If it doesn't work though, there's no blame. This is not failure. This is an ongoing experiment. And remember, we were already in some of this change before all this. So let's I used to not like Nike, but I think the just do it premise is not bad. Just do it, try it, evaluate it. If it was good, keep working at it. If not, leave it on the side of the road and keep moving ahead. Find coherence. Really try to listen, in my language, listen to what the Spirit is saying to us. How are we kind of come together? If needs are more around community outreach, we need to listen to that. If we're learning that, this is just an example, our younger families are still really struggling after this weird school experience they've had for the last couple of years, we need to really listen to that. So what longs to emerge here? And then hold steady, we're running a marathon, not a sprint. I think that's true in a lot of things, but I think it's definitely true here. And then she says, embrace the disorientation. Now, we Presbyterians kind of organized around decency and orderliness. It's not in our DNA to embrace disorientation. And so when smart people say you really need to think about what that looks like, we need to pay attention at least, and then engage new discoveries. So I've really been helped by that. It's like a two-page thing. And then a couple last thoughts, and then we can have a discussion. So from this great book from Hannah Boimler and Mark Silk, The Church is Dying, but it's not dead. You might be reminded of a little Monty Python moment, not dead yet, but I think what they're trying to say is there's still hope and possibility and life in this institution. Whether it's a particular congregation may not be the case. What I do know is every presbytery I know, presbyteries are regional bodies, every presbytery I know right now is closing some of its churches. And it could be a big presbytery with me, Chicago or Philadelphia, or the tiny one from which I came. They've closed 3 churches in the last year. That's going to keep happening. Particular congregations are going to have hit their life cycle, and either their location or their way of life is just not going to appeal to a new generation. In my mind, that's never a sign of failure. That can be a sign of true faithfulness. You gave it a good run, and the run is over. But the big picture of church is not dead yet. There are still lots of pockets of energy and excitement and creativity and innovation, And so we need to claim that as we move ahead. And find a voice. Hannah Boimler's Silk, this was an old slide I probably did 3 years ago, Mary Angela. You know, they talk about the Quakerization of the Mainline, and they use the Quakers as a model of a group and a tradition that continues to, in crass terms, lose market share in American religiosity, but has a voice on matters that are important to them around peace or justice. And so we still, even if we're in the decline and not that thing everybody shows up to on a Sunday morning, there's a voice to be shared on, and we can go down a list of particular issues, but I think the bigger point is find a voice on the issues that matter to you and speak out. And it's not as if, you know, every congressional representative or senator is going to pay attention to that all the time in the way they might have in the 1950s or 60s, but still finding a voice is worth doing. And then Diana Butler-Bass says, don't wait around, kind of waiting for things to change or waiting for things to die, move with the Spirit. And then one of my favorite quotes from Eliot, you know, and the church must be forever building and always decaying and always being restored. That was 120 some years ago when those words were written. So it's not like this is a totally new enterprise for us. He just puts it more poetically. So what does that restoration look like for us? Oh, that's that. So that's what I want to say. I skipped a few things. We could go back if we want, but I think it's better just to kind of open this up for conversation. And again, let's talk with one another, and I'll kind of try to moderate things. And on some things, I simply won't know the answers. I'll say I don't know, but I have lots of opinions too. So, what do we want to talk about?
John.
Bill, let's go Bill first.
You mentioned the Quakers and the fact that I understand that they don't go out and proselytize, but they seem to be strong as ever and maybe growing some. But to help me, John, understand the growth of the so independent evangelical churches that are sort of outside of the mainstream, that their parking lots are enormous, they have coffee bars and ATMs in the lobby, and are they growing because of certain ideology or political hopes? Because they seem to be thriving, don't they? Some of them?
Some of them. So I hope, Bill, he had a little point about the Quakers at the beginning and then a bigger point. So I don't know if the Friends are growing or not, Bill. I think the point of this book that I read is whether they're growing or not, they haven't given up their tradition of finding a voice and sharing their values in the bigger world. That's their calling. And that we in the main line, you know, the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the Lutherans and the Presbyterians can do the same thing, but instead we sometimes say, oh my goodness, we're on the decline, we're just going to kind of fold up our tent and go home, but we still have a voice to share. So I think that's worth emulating the Quakers about, actually. And then Bill's second question was around what have been called megachurches, kind of independent, non-denominational, big churches that really started in the 70s. I know some about them. I think the current things that are happening is they've plateaued. They're not growing anymore either. So there's that piece of it. The second piece of it is a kind of founder syndrome reality is happening where they're predominantly white and they were all male led. So I can say where the men who started them in their 30s now are at retirement stage. And so there's a real question when you build a church around a personality, not around a tradition, what's the sustainability in that? And I think what they're learning is that some of them are not sustainable, or that when they call their second generation of leaders, like the Saddleback Church, some of you might know the name Rick Warren, who I think has done a pretty decent job with this, has just retired, and they named a new pastor. And in their tradition, they kind of name it's the pastor and his wife, and they kind of offer them as a team. That guy's got a big job because he's filling he's filling a guy who wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life that sold probably 10 million copies. And he's living with a lot of these same pressures that we are in terms of cultural expectation and families. You know, in Southern California, there's soccer practice on a Sunday morning like there is in Philadelphia, right? So, and then the third thing is, Bill, at least that's happening that have rocked those churches. And there's a church in Seattle called Mars Hill, but there have been others where there have been misconduct scandals where those founding pastors have been found either sexual misconduct or some kind of either financial or just power improprieties happen. And again, when a church is built around a person and not even a session or a tradition, that's really rocked those places. So that's part of the answer. The other part is, what's the attraction to them? When I was in Chicago, all those years ago, I was at a big downtown church, but there was one of the 2 or 3 most well-known mega churches was out in the kind of northwestern suburbs called Willow Creek. And what Willow Creek did, which was brilliant, is go door to door, which even that phrase makes us nervous, but they went door to door and they said, we're looking to start a new church. Do you go to a church currently? If they said yes, they said, God bless you, went to the next house. If they said no, they said, well, we're pulling together this experiment for people who aren't church people. So they built a whole church around non-tradition. And so you came with, I don't know if they had an ATM, but I know they had a coffee shop and all those other things, and they did lots of special interest groups, you know, Willow Creek people who are Harley owners, or Willow Creek people who read, you know, Harry Potter or whatever. So lots of community, lots of affinity, very low liturgy. You didn't need to have any church experience when you showed up on a Sunday morning. And that was appealing to a lot of people. So there's that piece of it. Other mega churches would play more into life is, and I say this with respect, life is chaotic right now. Come to our place for a little bit of order and a little bit of clarity, because it seems like values are just off the table. And at our place, whether it's around issues of gender especially or other things, you can find some order and some clarity, and it's not so much we'll tell you what to believe, but here's what we believe and we invite you to come along. And I can understand if how that can appeal to a certain segment of the population. What will be really interesting, Bill, is to see how all of this keeps playing itself out and how these guys are doing after the pandemic and how they're doing, this is a way longer answer than you asked for, but how they're doing post succession, you know, the next, not like Roman and Logan and all those guys, but succession and how they're going to do with this next generation of leadership. And the other thing is, in a couple of these situations where there has been some misconduct and scandal, you know, a church that builds itself around a leader doesn't necessarily have a strong governance in place. But once there's misconduct on the table, then governance emerges from within, and that makes it a whole different, then they're kind of getting closer to our tradition, right, where you have a session or a council or whatever. So I think their numbers are flat, Bill, if not declining, and I don't know what that means. I think I would have to do a lot more looking up and put a whole different slide up there. But it's certainly a phenomenon that has been written a lot about in the since, you know, the mid-70s and onward. Chris.
Yeah, in my experience, there has often been the attitude in the mainline churches that a person gets involved when they get on a committee and start working in the organization, and that the question is rarely asked, what can the church do that nobody else can do for? I mean, you know, there are PTA committees, there are sport league committees, there are all kinds of committees you can work on. What does the church offer that's unique?
Do you hear? So Chris said, maybe I won't treat it as rhetorical, But the question, what can the church offer that's unique? And I think that's a big question on the table right now. I'll take that, and then I have a little tangent to that. So I had a really dear educator colleague in Rochester who said, how are we different than the PTA? Or how are we different than the junior league? And I hope the difference is some of the spiritual questions about meaning of life, who is God, what is God up to, what's the meaning of my life in this bigger picture. And also, I always add, when you're looking at ethical things like climate or race or whatever, I do think the religious values bring a different response to that and a deeper response to that. And if we're not doing that, or if we're hiding that, I mean, that's different than, as Bill said, proselytizing people or being inauthentic to who we are. But we here, and the church in general, does have a message and a vision and a set of values and beliefs that if we put them under, we're told not to put them under a basket, right? Or, let our light shine. Mm-hmm. I think what I was thinking as you were asking the first part of your question is, I do think I was talking with somebody about this the other day, the whole issue of membership, period, I think is up for grabs. We don't join alumni societies anymore. We don't join Rotary or Kiwanis in the same way that we used to. I think people will join churches differently, and so that slide I had early on is going to mean less and less and less and less and less. And I have lots of colleagues who say it would be much better to say, okay, how many people are engaged in what you're doing, whether they join or not. We Presbyterians are numbers people, so we quantify stuff. And the other thing that's shifted a lot, it used to be, whenever the used to be was, you believed something, and then you found a community and joined that community with common beliefs. I think what our effort is here, and lots of places I know, is you come and experience a community and you like them for either the way they worship or I'm laughing, this is very parenthetical, there's an old article that said people judge churches by two things, parking in their restrooms, and maybe a third thing is their nurseries. But you come to a place and you like it for its worship or for the way it serves the community or for its adult education or whatever. And then you say, after a while, you say, all right, I'm engaged with this community. I'm now ready to think about what it means to be a member of that community. And only then the belief conversation happens. So kind of flip from belief to belonging, and now it's belonging to belief. I think that's happening right now too. But I think if we're shy about our values, number one, we don't do our values well. But I also think that people look at us and say they're lukewarm. Why would I join a place like that? Other thoughts? Stan.
What extent of the seminaries or the faculties in the seminaries playing a role, and does everybody pay attention to them, or do they ignore?
So Stan's question is about seminaries, and I'm laughing only because I was at this peer group I was with the other day. There are a couple seminary faculty and one seminary president, and I tell you, they're scrambling. My seminary, McCormick in Chicago, just sold its building because it was overcapitalized and under-resourced. It's going to stay open. It's going to find a new home and maybe partner with another seminary in a new home. But there are probably 20 or 25 seminaries, Stan, that have done that all across the board. Evangelical, conservative, Roman Catholic, Protestant, independent. So, that's driven by these numbers, obviously. If there are fewer people in the churches, there are fewer churches. If there are fewer churches, there are fewer ministers needed. That's, even I can figure that out. Student debt is a bigger issue than it ever has been in terms of people going to seminary. More and more churches are able, or fewer and fewer churches are able to offer full-time positions. So it's just in the marketplace, it's less appealing of a career path. If I'm going to go to a small church and only get a half-time salary, so I either need to find a second job that's not in the church or a second church and try to cobble things together. That's the trend. That really is the trend. I think seminaries, Stan, are trying to figure this out. All of them are trying to figure out different, what do you call it, delivery systems for curriculum. So my seminary fought online for a long time. They said, no, you have to be in the classroom to be able to learn together and all that. We're embracing online now because they just realized that we can't get students on site in the same way. And to broaden our market share, we need to be able to get if you're in Chicago, to get a student in Iowa or Nebraska to come online who won't move to Chicago to go to seminary. I think, I can't be generalized about how they're responding to this. I know the seminaries are trying really hard to try to figure out what water they're swimming in. And I think some are doing better than others. I know a couple are having new degrees. Excuse me. Like you'll get. I like Master of Divination, by the way. That was good, Mary Angela. But I wish that were the case. So our graduation degree is called Master of Divinity. That gets you ordained. But so a joint Master of Divinity and a social work degree, or a joint Master of Divinity and an MBA, for example. And so people with a little bit of entrepreneurial training can figure some of this out better than some of the rest of us. So I would say, this is a terrible answer, Sam. I think they're working hard at it. I think, as we all know, academic institutions aren't, even if they're kind of progressive ideologically or theologically, they're not necessarily big on change. It's hard to change even a small seminary where you still have the guilds and the faculty and all that. And some are doing better than others, I would say. Jeff and then Mary Angela. Oh, okay.
I was really caught by that Great Resignation piece, and I was surprised to hear that it was happening in the church, because I would think with COVID, right, people are really needing that leadership. And so do you think that Great Resignation that happened, that's happening within the church had to do with being overwhelmed? Like, was it too much, or was it, I don't know, cracks in their beliefs and the structure of the church were just starting to be more visible? Like, I'm curious as to.
It's a great question. I think it's still not fully synthesized, all this, but I think all the anecdotal things I read a lot of articles and have my friends, I think it's less a crack in their belief, but more a crack in their capacity to do what they think needs to be done to lead an institution through all this. And so burnout, that phrase is used a lot. And COVID, if you were at a 100-member church in COVID, in an earlier version of COVID, you had to figure out, all right, I had church friends who couldn't, again, judgmental, curious, not judgmental, but couldn't figure out what to do on a Sunday morning. So some of them were doing, very old school phone calling. So you got everybody dialed in to hear a service. So nobody was on your phone, nobody was on a laptop, they couldn't Zoom or FaceTime. They were doing the best they could to figure out with the technology they had and the capacity they had. But they didn't have Dan or Ken or Mary Angela to help us figure out the technology like we did here. So that part of it, so suddenly you were trying to be a counselor, you were trying to be a preacher, you were trying to be whatever, and a producer, and you were having your own personal experience with COVID, which, some of us are introverts, some of us are not, so some were okay being remote or being the only person in a building, and for others that was really, really difficult, not to mention, whatever kids or spouse you might have had. So I think it was that combination of things, and it's not quite fair to call that burnout, but burnout's a part of that, but all of that, and just said, I just don't have the emotional, spiritual, technical capacity to do this. And it's, if not literally, it's figuratively killing me, and I've got to get out. I read that story time and time and time again. And that obviously has implications. I don't know if that's going to be permanent for some of these people. A couple people I know did that, and now they're landing somewhere else. But to Stan's question, if there's no place to land, even if you want to land somewhere else, what does that look like too? So, Jeff.
When you consider the apostles in the New Testament, they go out in the world where they're not only going out in the world where there aren't churches, I mean, they're going out in the world where there's nothing in terms of, and they're all separated from each other. They were a church of 12, and now they're separate, and they spread and do all this kind of thing. And I'm wondering a couple of things. Did they compare to each other their successes and communicate what's working and what's not working, number one? Number two is, did they anticipate at all in the New Testament, did they anticipate at all this kind of a period that the church is going through?
That's a great question, Jeff. I don't know. I don't think at the end of the day they kind of texted each other and said, "How did your day go?" I think if you read the epistles, you'll see various levels of, Paul's writing to some churches that were deeply conflicted and writing to some churches that were doing okay. And you read some accounts in Acts about growth, but I don't think everything was a growth enterprise. And then what really happened, Jeff, as we know, once that kind of official imprimatur in 300 or whenever, 300, where suddenly it was okay to be Christian, then that changed that whole narrative. So oftentimes I'll read an article about, well, if we just go back to being the church of the book of Acts, where we kind of strip down where we kind of strip down the trappings or the structure or whatever, and go back to some of those original practices, especially when you read in Acts that nobody had any need and everybody cared for everybody else and all that, which is certainly not where we are in 2022 in terms of the church. That's intriguing. How you get there from here makes my head spin a little bit. And it was also then, you were to practice Christianity in that first century was really, you had to do it in hiding. And we don't have to do any of this in hiding in the U.S. anymore. I'm not sure I'm getting to what you're saying. I don't know that early literature that really was stopped being written around 100 BCE anticipated, number one, the massive growth that would happen, this may be a tangent, maybe not, looking at the Church of England's this week, that wasn't anticipated in Ephesus or Colossae or Rome, what it looks like now. So I like some of the idea of getting back to some of the basics, but it's never going to look like that, I don't think.
One thing that was encouraging was T.S. Eliot wrote.
Yep.
We talked about it at the end, and he said that always being restored. So having that kind of confidence that if you're still preaching this good news or whatever, I think even if there's another 12 people left in the whole world, it's still.
No, I think that's right, Jeff, and I'll let that be the last word, except I'll let what I'm going to say be the last word, because that's how we roll, right? But I think that reminder is true. I think the church has to be open to restoration, though, and we haven't always been. Presbyterians at least have been called, God's frozen people, right? And so change is not easy for us. And so what does restoration look like for us? And I think to go back to the Susan Beaumont stuff, which I find really compelling, I think also speaks to the Eliot point, experiment and learn. Let's try things. And I think for us here, and for many churches that I know and love and have worked at and we know and love, the building is the focus of everything. I think the future is going to be some stuff in the building, some stuff online, and some stuff in the community. And I think we're around the edges of online. We really haven't figured out stuff in the community much at all. whether that's at a retirement facility or Campbell's Place for Theology on Tap or somebody's home. I think that's going to be the future. And that's harder for us to figure out. Not that we don't get that in our heads, but how you do that logistically, but also how you change your kind of thing. But I think part of that innovation is beyond this place. And I think the other thing is I had a good Episcopal priest friend in Rochester, and they were going through some really rough times. And he said a version of what you just said, Jeff, so we'll give him the last word, I guess. He said, we've got a tradition. It has a longer lifespan than any of these 10 or 50 or 100-year time frames. If we kind of keep at the tradition faithfully, being mindful of, not exactly as it's always been. I mean, the Mass isn't offering Latin anymore, for example, but keep that tradition going, that people will respond to that, maybe not in the numbers that we've been. And I always like to remember as a historian, for most of American history, membership numbers were here. It was post-World War II that they went up here. So we think, well, we were always up here. Well, most of the time we were down here. So not to get so worked up about membership numbers, but get worked up about how are we being faithful? How are we serving our communities? How are we engaging the needs of our people who show up? How are we engaging the needs of people who don't show up, but we're going out to meet them? I think those are going to kind of be the rules of how we're doing. And then the rest will kind of take care of itself. You guys are awesome. Thanks, Mary Angela, for pulling all this together. There's still a bunch of snacks over on the table. And can you say a word about the next month?
Yes. So
Thank you to you all.
Next month, we have Josh Hitchens. He's an author, local author, who wrote Haunted History of Delaware. He's a historian, and he has written recently the Haunted History of Philadelphia. So he comes at things from a much more historic perspective for the spooky season. So we're having him come and talk to us about his writings and the books that he has written. So please join us next month. And after that, we have, I didn't put my thing up here, Mural Arts of Philadelphia, Jane, and I cannot remember her last name, I apologize. But come back for those. It was very nice to see you. Have a great rest of your day.